So I'm not quite sure what this is. When Donna asked me to do this, I've spoken to Donna's class and enjoyed it quite a few times over the years. And then she said, well, just what are you going to do? Talk about yourself. You're probably going to write a memoir anyway, are you? And of course, I hadn't really thought of that. And then it piqued me that maybe I would use this class to just start rambling a bit about my life and just see where it takes me. I have no idea where I'm going. I suspect that that I won't get through everything, but at about 10 to 2, I'll stop. And if there are any questions on the story so far, we can entertain those questions. Mm-hmm. So this is, as much as anything, as I'm rambling, a search for me too. There should be a lot of war stories that might be entertaining, but I don't know what the overall thrust is. It's 50 years. No, it was in 69 when I got my first paid gig as a director. It was for the McGill Players Club, directing Threepenny Opera. I was paid $250, which I, of course, then immediately put back into the production. It was a great production. We took it in the Sandwich Theatre in the Union. We took all the seats out. You got 2 free beers when you bought your ticket, and we put tables and chairs in. And my generation at McGill, which I'll get to in a second, was really an amazing group of theater people. People like Fiona Reed actually played a sex worker in Threepenny Opera. She had a small part in it. So we were a lot out of my generation that graduated. And then, of course, we never paid for the royalties of Threepenny Opera. So for years, I was followed by the Brecht estate with legal letters saying, you never paid the royalties and so on. But they never found me, and they never got me, as it were. You can't catch me. So I don't know where this story is going to lead. I know that as I look back, having resigned from Infinithéâtre, effective sometime in February, Zach Fraser's taking over. You're probably all aware of that. I know one of the things that I look at the moment is the lack of craft that we have in terms of our values of Canadian theatre. I know that's one of the things I look back at the moment. Kelly Nestrick, the Globe and Mail critic, he's actually quite a good writer, and I quite agree with him occasionally, but a couple of years back, he said he was tired of theatre. So what does he do to try and rejuvenate his interest in theater? He follows and tracks and writes a big story in the Globe about an amateur high school musical. Well, that kind of says it all. He thinks that that's what theater is. That's where he should go to rejuvenate his interest in theater. He should have followed Shauna McKenna, Tom Rooney. He should have followed people who have real craft, maybe followed Chris Abrams on an arc of how to develop and direct a show. No, instead, he thought his inspiration was going to come from a high school musical. When I look and I see the consequence of this lack of craft, and I stumbled on a very short interview with Dame Judi Dench a while back. She's 80, right? She was in leather and jeans and is on a talk show, and she does a very short episode from a monologue of Twelfth Night, Viola. And she just rings the words. They're so clear. The emotions are so true. It is so limpid and so understandable. She turns Shakespeare into an ice cream sundae. We don't have that. We never ultimately focused our value system on craft in the medieval sense of the term, the craft of theater. And that worries me. when I see what's happening to the theaters around me, the Centaur is the fast disappearing theater in town, cut down to 5 productions, 3 weeks a show. I mean, to me, the nadir of the Centaur was the one-man show that came from Toronto. Torquil Campbell, he didn't even have the ability to learn the lines. He actually had a music stand. He was flipping through the pages as he was doing his one-man show. It's no wonder that the audiences will have disappeared when that's the kind of fare that we're prepared to put up on the stage. So I'm not sure where, as I say, where this is going. It scares me. And obviously the pandemic is a new twist, that a new challenge for us. Someone been, like I say, over 50 years now. It was in 69 that I got my first paying gig. Someone normally in my place, in other cultures, would be said, "Hey, you're an elder," and there would be a certain respect. And yeah, I regret personally that that's not the case. Maybe that's a little bit of selfishness, but sure, that's permitted occasionally. But I wonder where we're going, and so this is really a process for me of trying to go back to my own roots and figure a few things out. So I thank you, Donna, for the opportunity. I have to say that Archives Canada phoned me up a year ago and said, "Hey, we want you for the Archives of Canada. We think there's a public interest in you." So I put together, legal boxes of all my papers and shipped them off to Ottawa for the archives. I got rid of a lot of stuff, but also apparently there was some value to it. So I actually got a tax receipt for the value of my archives. Now, my only problem is that I'm not earning enough to actually be able to use the tax receipt to reduce my taxes. But maybe I'll be able to earn enough to make use of the tax receipt. So who am I? How did Guy Sprung become Guy Sprung? And what is it? So on my parents' side, and it's a fun story, so I will tell some of it. They were each one generation removed from farming. On my father's side, his mother was part of the whole settler movement that took the land grab that I tried to talk about and fight on, and had farms in Saskatchewan. And on my grandfather's side, both of whom, by the way, I never knew, he was born on a farm in Pictou County, a bit near Belleville, ironically just a stone's throw, literally, away from where Marion Ackerman's father's farm was. Marion Ackerman founded 1774, which then became Infinithéâtre. So the closeness to the land was there. On my father's side, they were church people. My father got a good licking if he played baseball on Sundays. And on my mother's side, my grandfather was the younger son of a small family farm on the North German plains. Because he was the younger son, I mean, the tradition was that only the older son got the farm. They didn't want to keep parceling it up. So the culture was the older son gets the farm, younger son gets kicked off. So he had to go to Berlin, got a job in a bank, a very sort of lower middle class world that my mother came from. How did they meet? So my father grows up in Winnipeg. How or where my father's parents actually probably never even finished grade school. So now you have this guy who suddenly gets interested in philosophy. He does a BA in Manitoba, he does an MA in Toronto, and he wins a scholarship, the German equivalent of a Rhodes Scholar, to go to Berlin to study philosophy, do his PhD. He didn't speak a word of German. So he goes in 1936 to Berlin, learns German, learns enough so that in August of 39, he can do his oral exam for a PhD. He does his oral exam, goes out and gets on the train and goes to London. Now, my mother she hated what was going on. She felt it was just a frisson of some kind. She couldn't, it's not that she wasn't Jewish, so her life was not in danger. She wasn't left wing like Brecht. She didn't have to go into exile for political reasons. She just had a gut instinct that she did not like what was happening. So what does she do? There's this Englishman, Englander, who's walking around the halls of the university in Berlin doing his PhD. She hears about him in 36, in the 30s, of course, Canadians weren't Canadians, they were Englander because they were part of the British, they were Englishmen because they're part of the British Empire. So she walks up to him in the hallways and says, hey, I got 2 tickets to the theater and my mother can't come, do you want to go? Well, my father was quite a shy, in his head kind of person. That was it. He was done for. They get fiancé. His father-in-law is okay with this, the mother's not, but he then, so he does his oral exam, goes to London, sees the situation, writes back to his father-in-law and says, put her on the train, the war is coming. In the meantime, I've got these letters, they're just absolutely incredible, because he wrote one every day, and each day it was, Hitler will never defeat England, these guys are too plucky, etc., etc. And then he said at one point, there's a saying, get on the train, the plane, the war's coming. And my mother was clever enough, she bought a return ticket. So we're talking August 39 now, the middle of August, the war's just 2 weeks away. She gets to the border and the border guards say, sorry, you can't leave. Fräulein, the war's coming, you can't leave. And she waives her return ticket, says, I'm just going to London for a week to learn some English. And I say, oh, okay, they let her out. So on September 1st, Hitler and Stalin march into Poland. On September the 2nd, my parents get married in London. So now my mom, according to the laws of the time, she's a Canadian citizen. So on September the 3rd, Chamberlain declares war against Hitler, but my mother is now a Canadian citizen, so she's not, as many of the German Jews are in London at the time, she's not put in prison. And they come back to Canada, married, and Dad signs up. And when asked, well, wait a second, how does a philosopher become a soldier? He just said, well, if you want to be a soldier, you got to be a philosopher. So he spends the war in the Canadian Army. And my point being, oh, by the way, he's part of the Allied victorious army that goes into Berlin in June of 45. And he goes to the university and they give him his PhD. So it's a fun story. But my point is that my father was a soldier, and I'm very proud. He really believed in the necessity of a democracy having a strong army of its citizens. He, of course, would roll in his grave when he sees the military-industrial complex that now has taken over, and the mercenaries that basically, you know, that war is now for profit, that it's all about industry. That was not, he was a traditional old-fashioned soldier who believed that he was doing the right thing for his country, and he fought the war that way. And that's when I was born. That's the family I grew up into. And up until the age of 17, I thought I was going to follow my father in the army. In fact, Guy, my name, I'm named after General Guy Simmons, who was my father's boss at the time, and he was the chief of the Canadian Defence Forces in Ottawa. Ironically, what's interesting is that right after the war, there was a competition. There was a real sort of competition between the Air Force and the Canadian Army for resources, and the Canadian Air Force was walking away with a lot of it because they had the program for the Avro Arrow. So when I did a show about the Avro Arrow in Toronto later, my namesake was actually was a character, not a character, was mentioned in the play as being one of the bad guys because, of course, the army was trying to get wrestle the budget away from the Air Force and trying to close down the Avro Arrow of the whole program. So anyway, there's that. By the way, in that same Avro show, we're talking about 1990. I did it at Cannes Stage, and it went to the National Arts Center. But I also had a character by the name of Brian Mulroney, who was an intern in Diefenbaker's government at the time that the Avro Arrow whole crisis was happening. So we had Brian Mulroney as a kind of a bit of an idiot on the stage, sucking up to Diefenbaker. It's one of the reasons actually I had a problem with my board at Cannes Stage, is because the Ontario bagman for the Conservative Party was on my board, and they didn't appreciate the fact that we were making fun of Brian Mulroney and the Prime Minister at the time. That's just an aside, and I'm jumping ahead. So up until the age of 17, I thought I was going to be a soldier, and those were the values that I had. Now, if anybody saw Kafka's Ape and Howard Rosenstein's amazing performance in the adaptation of Franz Kafka's short story, you will see where the politics of the I updated the 1917 anti-war to become an anti-mercenary piece of theater. So you can see where the motivation to try and to nail the mercenary industry in the States would have come from. So again, that's just jumping in. So at 17, I think I'm going to be a soldier, but my father resigns from the army, and what does he do? He goes to India to learn Sanskrit, and in actual fact, he translates some of the early Buddhist texts from as I wrote once of them when I wrote about them, from incomprehensible Sanskrit into incomprehensible English. But he is actually the translator of record for some of those early Nagarjuna texts, and I'm still getting royalties from that. But I then decide I want to become an archaeologist. I'm enthralled by these books about the discovery of Troy, about Heinrich Schliemann, about the civilization in Mesopotamia and Ur of the Chaldeans and early Egypt. So I come to McGill thinking I'm going to be the first Western archaeologist into China. That was my objective. And actually it was kind of fun because I was able to, some of that residual fascination was able to kind of itch it a bit when we took Fin de Partie to Cairo, when we represented Canada and Quebec at the Cairo International Film Festival, and we took our bilingual and totally illegal version of Fin de Partie Endgame to Cairo. This was in September, and we were there for 9/11. So we saw the reaction to the destruction of the towers from an Arab point of view. And in the hotel we were in, Sheraton, Cairo, the waiters were all cheering because they figured the Americans were getting their comeuppance for what they were doing in Palestine and to the Palestinians. Anyway, it was a bizarre look from another perspective of the whole situation. So I go to McGill to try and thinking I'm going to become an archaeologist, and I'm fascinated by these worlds. By the way, it was quite amazing to be able to actually take that camel ride around the sites, and I'm convinced, just in doing some of the research, that the whole Arab scientific world, I mean, the astronomy that the ancient Egyptians knew about And the pyramids, by the way, the 3 pyramids, they're set up as an exact a replica of the stars of Orion's belt. So they knew, and apparently around the pyramids, there were thousands of little pyramids that represented the night sky at the time of the precession, which happens every 27,000 years. And when the star rises at a certain time, this is how the configuration of the stars would have been. Anyway, they knew more about astronomy than we had ever dreamed about. And I'm convinced that Galileo probably read some of those Arab texts and got his ideas for the fact that the Earth goes around the sun, as opposed to the opposite from the Arab scientists and the Arab texts. But that's just a small theory. I've never read anybody actually saying that, but certainly the Arab astronomers at the time of Galileo knew full well how our universe, how our galaxy was operating. McGill, back to McGill. So we're mid-60s now, and in my first year at McGill, I am absolutely, I'm just despondent because my teachers are so bored with what they're teaching. They seem to fall asleep as they're teaching. I certainly fall asleep as they're teaching. So there's nothing for it, but I took a gap year after that first year. I didn't know what I was going to do or why I was going to do it. So I went hitchhiking around Europe, and I end up in southern Germany, in a town called Freiburg in the Black Forest, with quite a reputation, a university with a very good reputation. And I decided to enroll in German literature, Germanistic, in Freiburg for a year. And so I do, and I'm taking some courses, re-strengthening my German, knowledge of German, Buddenbrooks, Thomas Mann. And I don't know anybody, and I'm actually a bit of a shy guy. I'm a bit of a loner. And I see in the canteen, the student canteen of the student center, it's called the Mensa. I'm there, by the way, as a German student, you can eat, what they call an Eintopf, which is a one-pot meal. It's usually lentils and a bit of pork or some sausage or something for about 20 cents is what at the time. So, you could survive as a student in those days quite well. But I see on the wall a poster for the acting club, the theater club of the University of Freiburg, Actors Needed. And it has a time and a place for auditions. Now, I've never had anything to do with theater, okay? I have no idea. I do not understand why that clicked. I saw that poster and I said, I'm going to do that. So I go to the auditions. Now it's the small studio theater at the university. There's 65 people in the same room, sitting in the house. One by one, everybody goes up to audition. 64 people audition one after the other in front of us all. And finally they say, noch jemand? Ist da noch jemand? Is there anybody else? And I'm scared shitless. And I put my hand up and I go to the front and I do the audition. It's a poem by Bertolt Brecht. Erinnerung an die Maria A. Und als ich aufsah, war sie nimmer da. So I don't know, somehow or other they gave me the part. It was a French play, Fernando Arrabal, of course, in German. It was called The Automobile Graveyard. It was a kind of redoing of the Passion Play. I had no idea who Arrabal was. I had no inkling of theater itself. And there I am cast in a play. And we do the show. And then the show is actually chosen as the West German representative on the International Student Drama Circuit that summer. So in the summer of '67, I'm in Zagreb with my fellow students, and we're performing at this international student theater event. The the Sorbonne is there with their adaptation of Rabelais. The Brits are there. Oh yes, they did a Charles Marowitz version of Hamlet on a balance beam with 10 actors, a cut down version. Charles Marowitz, if anybody knows the history, he was an American who was living in London, and his thing was to take Shakespeare, chop it into nice palpable bits. And so they were doing that. And the Russians were there from Moscow. You know, they had a play, boy meets girl, girl meets tractor, and all three live happily ever after. And then there was the play, it was a John Arden play, an anti-war play, Ars Virumque, which is of course the opening line of Virgil. But they did it in Yugoslavian, and I bet you I could identify every actor in that company still today. So we would watch a show at 10 in the morning, we'd watch another show at noon, we'd watch another show at 2, another at 6, we'd perform ourselves, and then at midnight you all go home and you know, find partners and end up under the tables at the marketplace near the church, doing who knows what. I had never imagined that theater had that power, that potential. So that was it. That was it for me. I came back to McGill, and yeah, I took a few more, you know, pretended to attend classes with German and French literature, but really I hung out in the Players Club and did my first show that I directed was an Arabelle play, two-hander on a balance beam. So at that point I had no choice. There was no conscious, you know, I think I want to do this, here's what I'm going to do. I just hung out in the theater in what is now called the William Shatner Student Union. By the way, William Shatner is a bit of a creep, so it hurts me every time I go by that building now. I can tell you a really horrendous story about Mr. Shatner, Captain Kirk, at a time when he was shooting his science fiction series in Toronto. It was in the early 80s. I knew one of the actresses who was playing opposite him. And she, after a day of shooting with him, she came home and she was absolutely still shaking. And I said, so what's up? What happened? And she said, well, I had a two-handed scene to play with William Shatner. And normally, of course, in a two-handed scene, you shoot over one shoulder, capture with one actor, and then you turn the camera around, shoot over the other shoulder, and you're on the other actor. So they shot him over her shoulder first. So you as an actor, you try and play with that actor to give them something so that the camera's actually capturing something live. So she played the scene with him. They turned the camera around. She started playing the scene, and William Shatner says, "Oh, there's something dripping from your vagina," and walks out from the camera, leaving her to play the scene on her own. So anyway, those are, I guess, the mid 80s and Hollywood. Where were we? McGill, right. So I'm hangout. Now at McGill at the time, we're talking 68, there were two factions in doing theater. One were the English expats, all with a bit of a plummy accent, doing Shaw. And they were, usually sort of from well-to-do British families, but they couldn't get into Oxford or Cambridge, so the family shipped them to McGill because it had an international reputation, and shipped them to McGill, and that way they could tell their people back home, "Oh yes, our son is at McGill in Montreal," and apparently that carried some kudos. So there was the Brit faction, and then there was the long-haired hippie faction doing anti-Vietnam wars and so on. Naturally, I was with doing Viet Rock and not doing Shaw. So at the end of one year of mucking about in the Sandwich Theatre, comes the annual general meeting of the Players Club. And in those days, we're allowed to call ourselves the McGill Players Club. Not anymore for copyright reasons. But so there's an assembly, and it's time to vote for the next president. So the British representative put their person up, and then there's a silence. And I remember Jeanette Kuczynski. I have no idea where she is, but Jeanette, I blame you for my life. She says, I nominate Guy Sprung. I didn't know Jeanette. I didn't know she knew me. She says, I nominate Guy Sprung. And so I was too scared to say no. So the two of us leave the room. I don't think I've got a hope in hell. I'm thinking, oh, thank God. Hello, we walk back in. I have been elected the next year's president of the Players Club. So now I have a responsibility. I don't know anything about theater except having played a little bit and seen some student productions. So I'm lucky enough to land a job as an ASM at the Red Barn Theatre in Ontario for that summer. And that's where I learned everything. I mean, it was summer stock. So you got to imagine you do, you have a week to rehearse a play, and then it runs for a week. And then meanwhile, you're performing one play, you're rehearsing the next. And it's in Jackson's Point. It actually has a bit of a history. I think it's still going now, the Red Barn Theatre. It was, I think, the very first summer stock theatre in Ontario, maybe even in Canada. And it was, you know, building flats, hanging lights. And in the end, also doing a bit of acting on stage. Gaslight was one of the shows that we did. I played one of the policemen, but I also played the villain in the melodrama Murder in the Red Barn, which obviously always they trotted out because it sold tickets. But that's where I learned what theater was. I mean, in a you know, it's $25 a week we were making. We're talking the summer of '68. So when I come back to McGill, I'm now president of the Players Club. And again, I just emphasize McGill in that season, '68, '69, we had so many plays on in that Players Club. I mean, I can remember one week it's not just we had a show every day of the school year. I mean, you know, nowadays the kids, they figure, oh, well, we're working for 3 months and do a show or something. No. We had a show every day of the school year, and it was packed. 150 people who came at lunch to eat their lunch. So it was called Sandwich Theatre, eat their lunch and watch a play of some kind. But I remember there was one week where we actually had 4 shows that we were running. So we had, you know, a show at lunch, a show at 4, and then 2 shows in the evening. And we would, you know, put the set up and down in the same day. Like I say, there was the energy of that year in theater, the desire, the hunger to do theater was extraordinary. And at one point, because I had started writing some reviews and so on, so I knew the editors of the McGill Daily. And at one point, we had a festival of plays. And they were all had a bit of an off sort of sexual connotation, although the Revenger's Tragedy was one of them. The Golden Screw was a musical, was another. And The Beard, and I don't remember, that was an off-Broadway hit, The Scandal, Billy the Kid giving cunnilingus on stage. So we did these as a festival, and the McGill Daily, I'm sorry I don't have a copy of it with me. I do have one somewhere. They decided they were going to publicize this festival by making the Daily look like an edition of the Midnight. Now, the Midnight was a soft porn weekly magazine that was come out. I think it was actually produced by Robert Lantos, who ended up being one of our big film producers. But it had as I say, soft porn articles about lap dancers hiding snakes in various places. I mean, totally ridiculous articles. So the editors of the Daily decide they redesign the front page of the McGill Daily to look like Midnight, this soft porn magazine. They have a picture of this guy called Randy Roddick. Now, if you guys know McGill, you know the Roddick gates, or the gates that on Sherbrooke Street, from one of the founders of McGill. Long hair, smoking cigarettes, and the whole thing is nothing but purple prose about how, you know, we're trying sex in the theater and doing this and doing that. And again, of course, the festival was totally sold out, and people were outraged at this front page issue, but it was all tongue in cheek. And that's, by the way, the McGill Daily at the time had some very serious hitters who went on. Mark Starowitz was one of the editors at the time. He ended up as the CBC head of documentaries and did some quite amazing work. But that generation of McGill graduates have gone on to leave their mark, I think, across Canada. So that's the kind of crazy things that we got up to. I remember one of the shows that we did it in Moyes Hall, was about Évariste Galois, who's a student activist, revolutionary from the 30s. We started the play off with an actor coming out. It was in Paris, right? A Paris student, the 1832 was the very first student uprising, I think, anywhere in the world, and Évariste Galois he led it, and so we started the show off, and meanwhile outside we have the marching going by McGill Française. So there's 10,000 people marching by in front of Roddick Gates, screaming McGill Française. We're doing a play about a student activist from 1832 in Paris, and one of the actors, it starts, but in the middle of the show, by the way, one of our technicians drove a Harley, and so we had him drive in. Moyes Hall was different in those days; it was flat. He drove in from the back of the hall with a pretend machine gun and pretended to take the whole audience hostage. So you know, we were slightly nuts in those days, and we got away with a load of shit. But there's no doubt that totally informed my sense of how you do things, how you reach audiences, what was valuable in theater, and Brecht became my man at that time in 1968, 69. What Brecht was his theories about mixing entertainment and politics. That seemed to me what theater could and should be. So in 1970, I graduate, so it's the 50th anniversary of my cohort of graduating at McGill in the summer, and I decide, well, if I'm going to do theater, I better know what I'm doing. So once again, I believe in the concept of craft. So to me, I was going to set out to Europe on my wandering apprenticeship days. And at the time, I had managed to finagle a job as the second string theater critic for the Montreal Star. I was Zelda Heller's sort of stand-in. But at the same time, I was also working, because I knew a little bit about backstage, so I was working as an IATSE worker. IATSE is the stagehand union, making quite good money, trying to save up the money to get to Europe. And in fact, I can remember a couple of times when I would do an IATSE setup in Place des Arts, get paid for that, and then get, you know, let go and walk out front, watch the show, and then go to the Star and write a review of it. But that was all just an attempt to put some money in the bank so we could go to Europe. So with my girlfriend, my partner at the time, this amazing, wonderful woman. We're still friends. We jokingly call her wife number one. We decided she wanted to go to London. I wanted to go to Berlin. We decided because I wanted to see Brecht's theater. We said, we'll go to Berlin for 1 year and then we'll go to London after that. And she can take her university courses in special ed at the University of London. So we went to Berlin. As I say, I went to Berlin because I wanted to go to Berlin. I wanted to see Brecht's theater. I wanted to see the work. But I was lucky enough, one of my German professors, Dr. Trudis Reber, knew the intendant, the artistic director at the Schiller Theater in Berlin. And she got me an invitation to be a hospitant, you know, a kind of an intern, unpaid, at the Schiller Theater. The Schiller Theater at the time had 3 theaters. I counted 35 plays they had in repertory in 1 month in those 3 spaces. So it was a factory. If anybody has seen Mephisto, the great film about the rise of fascism in a German theater, it was that theater that Mephisto essentially was centered on. So Trudis Reber, thank you for that 50 years ago. You are also responsible for the course, the journey of my life from then. Because when I got there, I was watching the rehearsals for a production of Shakespeare's Henry IV, and the director Ernst Schröder was one of the best known actors in Germany at the time, and we started talking about Shakespeare. We took a shine to me, I think partially because I was Canadian, and then he went to the higher ups and he said, hire this guy. So I actually ended up with the job as an assistant director at the Schiller Theater for the rest of that year. Ernst Schröder was at the time the #1 actor in Germany, the kind of Laurence Olivier of Germany. He had gone through the war at the Schiller Theater. He was wired and slightly nuts, and an incredible actor. He had played, because the Schiller Theater did have some very good productions. Samuel Beckett came and did his German versions of Endgame, Krapp's Last Tape, and he directed the German productions. And Ernst Schröder was loved and adored by Samuel Beckett. Played Ham in the German premiere of Endgame, Endspiel. But the way you know who's the #1 actor in Germany, or is considered, is they get to play Everyman at the Salzburg Festival. Everyman, of course, is this great medieval story about, you know, the everyman being called to justice by God. And at one point, the whole city of Salzburg gets in on the show. It's done outdoors on an outdoor theater when the bells summon Everyman, Jedermann, to the netherworld, and the church bells are on cue from all across Salzburg, come in and over and the audience and playing. Anyway, he was playing Everyman at Salzburg in those days. So he was Laurence Olivier of the German theater. He took his theater really seriously. And again, that's, I suspect, something that rubbed off on me. He hated what was being developed into Eurotrash. He hated where acting was going. He hated the younger generation and their lack of any sense of what the script meant and the digging into the script. So he actually ended up, one of the reasons was because he was so upset where theater was going, he ended up committing suicide. Is one of the great tragedies of German theater. There were other elements involved, but that's how seriously he took his theater. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know where to go. But it's okay. I'm not about to commit suicide. I have 3 great kids, by the way, one of whom and two stepkids with my wonderful and amazing partner. My daughter number two tomorrow is defending her PhD in the Montreal Neuro. She has a PhD in neuropsychology that she's presenting to the panel tomorrow. So thank God my kids did not go into the arts. I see, Donna, that I'm really slow here. Do you want me to stop, or what do you want me to do?
No, I think we'll talk about the Half Moon Theatre at least, and then maybe we can have you again to talk about Canadian theatre. Okay, unless you want to go after 2 o'clock. Okay.
No, I don't know quite where to go. So that was Germany, and that was my wandering apprenticeship years. So after we finished, my partner and I at the time, we go to London, and it's a totally different relationship, because as a Canadian, I know colonial. Now we're talking 71, right? Oh, Canada. Oh, yes. Do we actually have a theatre in Canada? Oh, yes. Yes. Sorry. No, we have no jobs for you today. So Judith is taking her classes at the university, and I'm trying desperately to hook in somewhere in the London theatre scene. Eventually, I hear about an actor who's living in a disused synagogue in the East End of London, Morris Colburn. So I walk in on this, and sure enough, it's an empty synagogue. The bima is still there. There's still a few Jewish relics, but it apparently has been deconsecrated. And Morris is this big, lumbering, working class Yorkshireman, wonderful man, amazing actor. And I'm the Andy Hardy from Canada. Oh, Morris, yeah, oh yeah, great space. So listen, why don't we turn it into a theater? Yes, well, says Morris. I can't do a Yorkshire accent, but yes, well, we were going to use it for rehearsals, but yes, I suppose. So he was living in the women's balcony up top, and down below was an empty space. And there were still the pews were still there. Around the women's balcony, in gold lettering, were all the donors who had donated to make the synagogue possible. This actually, I don't know if you can see it. See, this is, that's the Half Moon about 1975. You'll see it's a building. There were people, some friends were living up top. The actual synagogue part is right in the backyard, because it was built in the 30s at a time when Mosley and the British fascists were out trying to rule the streets. So any synagogue that was built at that time had to be hidden, as it were. It was camouflaged. That's how the Half Moon looked. And I, with Andy Hardy, let's turn it into theater, and I wanted to direct a Brecht show. I cast Morris in it. He got me introduced to a couple of designer friends, some other acting friends of his, and in between his cups of tea, which happened every hour, I think it's time for a cup of tea now, don't you think, Guy? And I'm hammering away and sawing away. No, Morris, we got a theater to build. Yes, no, but I think a cup of tea, don't you? At that time, tea was 2.5p across the road at Fredson's Calf. If we had money, if we had the extra sixpence, we would go to a little Jamaican grocery store and get a Jamaica ginger cake, 6p and a cup of tea, and that was for us heaven. And so we turned that synagogue into a theater, and we're rehearsing an early Brecht play in the jungle of the cities. Still one of the craziest plays, I think, that Brecht ever wrote. Not one of his more political ones, because it's early, before he had seen the light of Marxism. And at one point, So the Morris has rented this and warned the Federation of Jewish Synagogues, who own the building, that there might be some rehearsals. But we haven't told them exactly what we're doing. But we decided it's time to get a bit of publicity. So we call in the local weekly rag, the East End Examiner, two young, wide-eyed, real sort of Eastenders looking for a story, and tell them about how we're preparing a Brecht play in the synagogue. And they come and they take a picture, and there are these hippies with hammers. Behind us is a big stash of lead, which I'll get to in a second. But it was lead that we had ripped off of roofs from the Victorian warehouses that were being pulled down so the container industry could move into the East End of London. And we were fencing it the next day then for 65 shillings a hundred weight to the local spot merchants who were all crooks and tried to cheat us, but we caught them cheating. But anyway, that was how we financed the conversion and the building of the set for the early Brecht play. Was by ripping lead off of roofs in the East End of London. Now, so anyway, these two young journalists come. They want a story. They want to get a byline in the Guardian, in the Times. So they play innocent. They interview us. We talk about Brecht and we talk about collective this and that. Next week, on all of those sort of billboards right next to where the journalists are selling their papers, the East End Examiner, there's a big sign and it says, Old Synagogue gets into the act. Okay, so we're on the back page. Hippies with hammers building synagogue being renovated. So what did our two wide-eyed East End London journalists do? They phoned the Federation of Jewish Synagogues. And they say, do you know what's going on in your synagogue? They're doing a play. They're doing a German play in your synagogue. Now, the Federation of Jewish Synagogues was one of the more tightly knit and organized Orthodox federation. But there was a young secretary who was our interlocutor, and he was a wonderful, really decent guy. But the rabbis, of course, objected quite rightly to the fact that we were doing theater in the synagogue. And so the week after, the billboards read, Jews ban German play in synagogue. Naturally, that made the Guardian and the Times and our wide-eyed journalists from East London got their byline as they wanted, and they knew exactly what they've been doing. And bless them, the rabbis never did anything. We got on and we opened the play January 27th, 1972, in the jungle of the cities. The reviews were fabulous. It was a great production, and that started the Half Moon, which, by the way, is still going today. It's one of the most respected community theaters in London. They've moved a couple of times. They have a wonderful building further east now, and we're at 2:00. And so I'm going to stop there with just the beginnings of the Half Moon, which is not very far. We've reached January 27th, 1972. I'm sorry, I hope I haven't bored people. Thank you.
It's been very fascinating, I have to say. Yeah, so maybe we can have you again to talk about Canadian theater, because
I'd love to get to the point where my theater is hijacked in Toronto, the Canadian stage, a bunch of nincompoops, and so that we end up with a Can stage now that has absolutely no reason to exist anymore, and has no, and it's basically when I read, I mean, I have to laugh. They claim to have 80,000 people perform for 80,000 people, but the 90% of those are in the outdoor Shakespeare venue that I built for them, and which the board at the time tried to cut for financial reasons. And that's where I ended up fighting with my board, because they wanted to cut the outdoor venue to save money. And I said, no, you can't cut that venue. And that's where we clashed. And it was one of the main reasons why the hijacking of Canadian stage actually went through. I will shut up here, but it would be good to get to that and have a more detailed analysis of what went down there, and a more detailed analysis of where Canadian theatre is now. But I really thank you for your indulgence, everybody. I'm sorry if it's
fascinating, Guy. Fascinating.
Yeah, really fascinating. And also you directed the first David Finario plays too, which is a big subject also. Anyway, okay, let's open it for questions.
You can see that it's the poster for the Old Vic when we took Balconville to London and then Ireland. But yes, that's true. David. Yeah, David.
Okay, so anyone who wants to ask a question, just unmute yourself and put up your hand, I guess, too. But anyway. No questions?
Hi, Patricia. Hello.
Hi, Patricia.
Hi. I don't really have a question. I just want to echo that I was totally fascinated, and thank you so much. And I sort of feel like we're going to have episodes of this, and and I like the slow pace. I couldn't come right at 1 o'clock, so I actually missed. I started in 1967, but. And I just want to say, I like the color of your wall. Hello.
Okay. Oh, yes.
A resonance there.
Yeah.
And just thank you for all that you've done. And I also hope that we'll hear what your projects are, what now, 50 years later or whatever. Okay. So thank you.
All right. You're very, very welcome. Just so you know, to my embarrassment, in order to pay the rent, I have to do some Ubisoft video games. So coming out in January is a video game called Prince of Persia, and I play the villain in it. So
typecasting again.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, somebody else want to ask a question?
I don't know. It's Doug Roger, can you hear me?
Yes, Douglas.
Hey, buddy. I very much enjoyed this ramble through things and parts of your backstory that you have not shared before, at least in my. So yeah, I think you should come back. I think there needs to be some. A little more vitriol coming up down the road. I think there's time to, I don't mean settle scores, but I do think it's like we're oftentimes too polite about things. And I would be especially interested in hearing about 1990 and all that went down and whatever. But anyway, thanks for this. We really enjoyed it.
Well, full disclosure, Douglas is a great playwright, and we worked together a couple of times. We even started our own theater together at the Tivoli in Hamilton. My God.
Yeah.
And it was one of the shows that never made it into the season that it could have been. And so we just went ahead and did it anyway, and changed the old Tivoli into a theater. And actually, I think we walked away and made some money on that.
Yeah, we actually did. Paid off my mortgage. So, so you know what? It's a career in the theater, Guy, and you too could be 100 air. Thanks, folks.
Okay. All right. Nice.
Okay. Anyone else? I think there's time for one more question at least.
It's me. This is Rahul.
Hey, Rahul.
Hi, Guy. So thanks for taking my question in the last one. But Guy, I would have so much wanted to hear your contribution to the Canadian theatre, and I want to thank you in advance for that because I'll attend the next session when it does occur. But I want to actually have no questions. I want to share a memory of how I got to know firsthand when I saw you and all that. I think you were introduced to the Montreal Theatre. I don't remember the year, but you and Gordon McCall were invited in Playwrights Workshop of Montreal, saying that the 2 new artistic directors have come to the city and let's hear their vision. I think that Centaur, with all the institutions, and Gordon McCall with everything at his disposal, changed his programming, but not the course of Canadian theater, even though everything was there for him. I think you, on the other hand, you worked for the development of the theater as a sector. And I want to so much thank you for that. You put the emphasis on the playwrights. You innovatively every day worked for what was needed for the theater community, may it be a space, may it be equity, may it be inclusion. And you emphasize localism. I do not know of a company where so many local playwrights have seen their work produced than your company, and of course, a little bit mine also. But this is remarkable. This is remarkable that you saw the national representation in local playwrights. So I want to thank you very much. You worked for entire sector, and we thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Rahul. It means so much. And, you know, anyway, but I think history, changing the world one play at a time is a major element in what we need in the future of our theater. So, Losh Paula.
Okay, are you willing to stay for another question, Guy, or?
Sure.
Okay.
All I have is a Canada Council grant to finish off today, but what's, you know, what that?
Okay, any other questions? No?
I have a question. It's Sylvia here, Sylvia Ruby. I'm wondering, Guy, what your reaction is to support from federal and provincial governments through the present pandemic situation, and whether you feel that the arts have gotten the support that they should have from the governments.
Oh, listen, the arts never, in Canada, never get the support we should get, pandemic or no pandemic. So, so no, I mean, it's when you consider the salary scales of what artists make in this country compared to the salary scales of any other major occupation or industry, I mean, you know, and just the recognition that artists don't get that they should in this country, you know, and I mentioned it very selfishly. I said, you know what? I mean, I would not be able to exist if it weren't for the frugalness of my parents, the generosity of my sisters, who were wonderful to me when we shared my parents' estate, and the generosity of my partner Tracy at the moment. I wouldn't be able to feed myself, you know. So no, of course not. You know, the government in Canada does not do a fraction of what it should do to recognize its artists.
But have they done anything in addition since the pandemic to help at all in any way because of the...
I think there are a lot of actors who have benefited from the CERB, the emergency fund, for sure. I think that if you were an established theater company, the Canada Council probably gave you a good whack of money, not enough, but tried to give some money out. We got a small amount from the Canada Council because we were on a project grant. And I think that at the moment, the Quebec government is saying, because we have a show that's coming up, right? The King of Canada is coming up and we're due to open on the 30th, but we had to delay it. And I think at the moment, the Quebec government is saying that we might be entitled to some special compensation because we've had to extend our rehearsal period. We'll see. So they're trying, and you know, let's face it, it's better than to the south of us for sure. So we should be we should be grateful for that, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting, you know, when the plague shut down the theaters in Shakespeare's time, Shakespeare's company, actually, they got a compensation from the king. They were paid a chunk of money because they had to close their theaters down. So way back then, there was compensation. I'm sure they probably were better compensated than we are. But anyway, Rahul can probably be more vitriolic about how little we are getting from the governments. But yes.
Thank you.
All right, we're
More
at.
questions? Or are you, have you had enough?
I have one
Guy?
question.
Anyway, yes,
Okay.
oh, there's Oren. Hi.
I have a question for you. It's probably personal interest, but you mentioned craft at the beginning and the disappearance of it. And I'm wondering where you think it went. How do you get it back? And what is it exactly? Is it more, because you see there's a lot of craft in television writing these days. I'd say we're sort of at there's some really great television writing, but where is craft in theater?
Okay, well, it starts with a value system. It starts with the schools. It starts with what we're teaching. I don't know. I unfortunately, I think the National Theatre School at the moment is at probably its lowest ebb ever in terms of what it's teaching its kids. I don't know if anybody else other than me locked on to their website when the pandemic came, because their graduating class could not go live, right? They couldn't do any live production. So what they did was they did a Zoom version of the productions that they'd been rehearsing. So individuals. It was so bad. Honestly, it looked like a bunch of high school kids who were playing with cameras. So if you want craft, you have to actually have people who believe in craft at the theater schools. Now, there are other elements here that also are in play. I had someone who teaches at one of the theater schools, it doesn't matter which one at the moment, tell me a story that in preparing a show, one of the actors had come up to him and talking about a role they were creating for him, saying, no, I can't play my grandfather because that would be disrespectful. So I'm going, wait a second. You have no belief in your own integrity, in your own craft, that you actually can't explore your grandfather as an actor? Get out of the theater right now. You should have no business in that. So there are all sorts of different elements that are affecting craft at the moment, yeah. Sorry. By the way, you have craft as a writer. I do take my hat off to you, and that the reading of your play last night from in Florida was fascinating. We'll talk. All right.
Okay, any more questions? Okay, so thanks very much, Guy. We'll have to have you talk about Canadian theater sometime because there's a lot to explore there. So thank you so much.